In 428, the Roman Empire fell apart. Europe had been broken for the first time in several centuries. The years that followed became known as the Dark Ages, due to the barbarism of not only the nobility, but also the Catholic Church. Within this era, however, sprouted a new language, known as English. Throughout the Middle Ages, English advanced further and further into its own unique language. Events such as the Battle of Hastings took this weird mash of Celtic and Germanic languages and turned it into one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. But as English got more and more advanced, people who spoke it wanted to do something with it. Not just pray or write about some Germanic king. They needed something new. Something that would shake things up. They needed a rebirth. The Renaissance was the period right after the Dark Ages, where the focus was more on human merit than the merit of the church. For the record, we'll be focusing on the English Renaissance, not the one in Italy or in France. I'm sorry. But before we actually delve deeper into the English Renaissance, we need to understand what happened in the Italian Renaissance. In 1420, the Italian Renaissance began as a way to reform the Catholic Church through humanism, or the idea of putting importance on humanity rather than a divine being. While today we think of the Italian Renaissance as a complete departure from the Catholic Church, this is not true. Many humanists were Christians themselves and simply wanted to reform the church, not tear it down. As the Italian Renaissance continued, artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello would leave their marks on the world of art, not only for their beautiful paintings, but also as the inspiration for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. On the literary side of the Italian Renaissance was a man named Francesco Petrarca, more commonly known as Petrarch, and his newfangled literary form, the sonnet. While Petrarch was not the first to write a sonnet, he definitely was the best at it, and his writings would inspire Sir Thomas Wyatt, an English politician, to eventually bring them over to England with his sonnet, Whoso List to Hunt. Though the Italian Renaissance began in 1420, it wouldn't be until 1485 when England would begin their own Renaissance, and even then, it wouldn't really get going immediately. Before the English Renaissance, England had partaken in not one, but two wars during the Dark Ages. The 100 Years' War came first, with the War of Roses coming almost immediately after. In the end, though, Henry Tudor was put on the English throne as King Henry VII in 1485. So now we can start the Renaissance, right? Wrong! You see, Henry VII and the government under him were still pretty close with the Catholic Church. While writers like Thomas Wyatt and John Skelton did introduce some humanist ideas in their writing, it would be a while until their ideas became popular. Skelton's especially, which came into popular culture in the Jacobin period, but nobody really cites him as a major influence. Nobody really cares. John Skelton's useless. As a result, both men died in relative obscurity. When Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, took the throne in 1509, it seemed like his rule would be very similar to his father's. However, a couple of key things happened that really shake things up. In 1517, a German monk with a funny-looking haircut named Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, condemning the Catholic Church and beginning the Protestant Reformation across Europe. This alone didn't change much in England, but what really tipped the scales was Henry VIII's flaming loins. Henry VIII desperately wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. In order to do this, Henry split from the Catholic Church and formed his own Church of England, which contained both Catholic and Protestant values. Henry VIII's actions and his flaming loins would affect the world of literature forever, believe it or not. After Henry VIII's death, his daughter, Mary I, was secretly placed on the throne. Though she tried desperately to return England to Catholicism, it didn't quite work. Since she died without an heir, power passed on to her half-sister, which would begin the most important era of the English Renaissance. Elizabeth Tudor was placed on the throne as Queen Elizabeth I in 1558, which finally allowed the English Renaissance to begin properly. Elizabeth was not only a Protestant, but also a writer and a patron of the arts. She frequently funded the writers she enjoyed and fought a constant battle to prevent theater from being banned by the Puritans. Under Elizabeth, humanist ideas from Italy had finally started to take shape within England, and the sonnet brought over by Thomas Wyatt had finally made it into the mainstream. Unfortunately, John Skelton did not make it into the mainstream. Sonnets became so popular in England that completely new rhyme schemes were created by writers Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. England wasn't only fixated on sonnets, though. Theater was also becoming all the rage. Plays like Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy and Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine the Great revolutionized the English play, turning them from clumsily written shows with little appeal to complex stories with action and rich characters. And of course, how can we talk about plays without talking about the most famous English playwright of all time, William Shakespeare? Shakespeare wrote plays of varying styles that appealed to everyone, creating revenge-filled tragedies such as Hamlet and romantic comedies such as Much Ado About Nothing. Shakespeare was also one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites and has endured in popularity quite well throughout the years. If there's one thing that could describe the Elizabethan era, it's its focus on intense emotion. From the revenge tragedies of the Spanish Tragedy and Hamlet, to the large-scale epic poems such as Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, to the works about the pure ecstasy of love, such as Philip Sidney's Loving in Truth. The Elizabethan era was heavily fixated on romantic ideas that would permeate throughout the rest of the Renaissance. Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen. And while there were many a theory about whether or not this was true, one thing was certain: she didn't have a child. When she died in 1603, many wondered, who would be the monarch of England? In 1603, James Charles Stuart, great-great-grandson of King Henry VII, became King James I of England. However, there was something odd about this new king. He was already the King of Scotland. James VI of Scotland had begun his reign in 1567, a good 36 years before he would take the throne of England. Many were uncertain, or even afraid of this new king. A Scotsman on the throne? That's absurd. He was also a Protestant, just like Elizabeth, which made Catholics even angrier than they were before, so much so that they tried to assassinate the guy multiple times. However, it wasn't all bad. He was still a frequent patron of the arts, similar to Elizabeth, and wrote like her as well. He even awarded the first pension of 100 marks a year to Ben Jonson in 1616, making Ben Jonson the first poet laureate. Writers during this era became a lot darker in tone, often delving into the realm of satire. Playwrights such as John Webster and Ben Jonson often criticized the ugliness of humanity and, more specifically, royalty. In John Webster's The White Devil, he satirizes how royalty often presents themselves as good and pure, only for them to indulge in corrupt and evil tendencies. Ben Jonson satirized the constant pursuit of money and lust in Volpone. Even historical chronicles were laden with criticism, as seen in Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, which criticized the royalty so much it had him beheaded 2 years later. Even if something wasn't a satire, it was still much darker than the Elizabethan era. For example, John Webster's Duchess of Malfi depicts the classic Elizabethan revenge tragedy with little sympathy for the main characters and significantly more violence. Sonnets also started to become more than just a way to obtain sexual favors, as seen in John Donnay's An Anatomy of the World. Even our Big Papa Shakespeare delved into this style with plays like Macbeth and The Tempest. Luckily, after King James I died, he had an heir to take the throne. Unfortunately, the new king would make things a lot worse in England. In 1625, Charles Stuart became Charles I of England, continuing the union between Scotland and England. Charles actually spent most of his life in England, so you'd think he'd be a little more popular than his dad. But no. Charles was actually less popular. Charles believed in the divine right of kings more than Elizabeth and James, and wanted the noble hierarchy of the Middle Ages to return to England. Similar to James, he also quarreled with Parliament quite a bit, but Charles was even worse about it. To his subjects, he was seen as an absolute tyrannical monarch, and his policies were seen as far too Catholic for the reformed religious groups of the era. Under his rule, two distinct groups started to rise: the Parliamentary Roundheads, a group who supported the Parliament more than Charles, and the Royalist Cavaliers, those who thought the king should have absolute power. These two opposing factions would eventually clash in what is known as the Second English Civil War. During this era, writers, almost as if to parallel the two warring factions, formed two distinct movements in literature. One of these movements was known as Cavalier poetry. This movement was a return to the highly romantic form of writing popular during the Elizabethan era. Though Charles I was highly unpopular, he still supported the writers he enjoyed like the monarchs before him, and let me tell you, he ate this stuff up. Poems like Richard Lovelace's To Althea from Prison, Thomas Carew's A Rapture, and John Suckling's, yes, that is a really funny name, Ballad Upon a Wedding, are all examples of this movement, which also came to be known as Carpe Diem poetry. Carpe diem being the Latin word for seize the day. On the other side of the spectrum, we have metaphysical poetry, which was significantly less popular than its romantic counterpart. Metaphysical poetry is so abstract and complex, in fact, that it's hard to pinpoint specific themes to go along with it. In fact, metaphysical poets were considered to be metaphysical poets several decades after their deaths. Poets such as George Herbert had their work published posthumously, and other poets such as John Donne and Richard Crashaw would only be associated with the movement later, far after their deaths. However, while these poets lived, and technically still live, in relative obscurity, the metaphysical movement is less seen as a movement within the Renaissance and more seen as a bridge between the Renaissance and the next period, the Neoclassical period. After several years of fighting, Charles I was finally defeated, being executed in 1649 by Oliver Cromwell. The Civil War ended, and England's only years without a king began. Charles I had been beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell was put in power as Lord Protector of England in 1649. In an interesting turn of events, Cromwell decided to form a republic for the first and only time in English history. At this point in time, Romanticism was on its way out in England, as literature began to shift gears towards a more logical frame of mind. The final hurrah for Romanticism came in the form of Andrew Marvell's The Garden, and To His Coy Mistress, both of them peak Carpe Diem poetry. Similar to the metaphysical movement of the Caroline era, writers began to bridge the gap between the Renaissance and the Neoclassical periods, with books like Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan, which came to be an important book of the Enlightenment era. The Republic of England didn't last terribly long, as Charles I's son, Charles II, returned to England in 1660, restoring the monarchy and ending the English Renaissance. Literary periods do not end with the Renaissance. As I've mentioned many times previously, there's the Neoclassical period, a period where writers tried to emulate Greek and Roman literature, and where romantic ideas were completely replaced with those of logical reasoning. But romantic ideas would not be gone forever. In fact, they'd come back stronger. The Romantic period returned to the values of the Renaissance, but moved even further with them than before. The Realism period, in tune with this swinging pendulum between logic and emotion, would heighten the logical ideas of the Neoclassical period, focusing on uprooting and exposing corruption. Finally, we have the Modernist period, which, in contrast with the others, is much more about experimentation with different forms of expression to create a period like nothing before it. We do not fully understand the scope or scale of our current period, but give it a couple decades and some keen hindsight, and we'll be able to see it. Perhaps we've returned to the pendulum of logic and emotion swinging back and forth. Perhaps we are completely different from anything before us. Who knows? I guess we'll have to find out. Also, I'm not going to answer it for you because I've been in this booth for 2 hours, it's really hot, and I want to sleep. So, good night.